I'm John Haskell, and I'm the director of the Kluge Center. And I know that there's a lot of people here I haven't seen at our events before, so I'll let you know, and maybe a good refresher for those of you who have come to our events, what our mission is at the Kluge Center, which is located through that wall here in the Jefferson Building. The mission, as established in the charter that was in 2000, is to reinvigorate the interconnection between thought and action. That's how the charter puts it. So it's the bridge between scholarship on the one hand and the policymakers like the people in Congress and elsewhere in Washington and the interested public on the other. So to that end, we at the Kluge Center bring some of the world's great scholars to the library to make use of the collections and engage in conversations that address the challenges facing democracies in this century. In this event, the Kluge Center, in conjunction with the Center for Women in Politics and the Center for Congressional and Presidential Studies at American University, are bringing together practitioners and scholars in an effort to shed some analytical rigor and insight on the upcoming midterm elections. As you probably know, the entire House, as well as about 1/3 of the Senate, is up this year, which means that power is in the balance. The balance of power will be determined by the elections. So, of course, it's extremely important. So we're going to go through some topics here with respect to the elections for the next 40 minutes or so, and then we'll leave time before the reception, which you're all welcome to, for some questions from the audience. Let me start by introducing our panel. Sara Fagen, who's immediately here to my left, is one of the nation's leading political and issue strategists at DDC Public Affairs, where she became a partner in 2011. She was a senior aide and White House political director to President George W. Bush. The word Wunderkind, which some of you may know, I'm not pronouncing the German right, I know, was created for people like Sara. This is not on her webpage. I can attest to this personally because I've known Sara for longer than either of us probably want to talk about. She gained a high-level position in the White House and in the presidential campaign before she was 25 years old. And in the White House, she was deputy political director well before she was 30. We're not going to get too specific other than that because that would be rude. The Wall Street Journal describes her as one of the people who perfected political micro-targeting. You can see her commentary on a regular basis on CNBC. Dr. ELAINE KAMARCK is, I knew that, but I even know her daughter-in-law who works at the library, is a senior fellow in the Governance Studies program as well as director of the Center for Effective Public Management at the Brookings Institution. ELAINE is an expert on American electoral politics and government innovation and reform. Her research focuses on the party system and the presidential nomination system. She's the author of several books, including How Change Happens or Doesn't, The Politics of U.S. Public Policy. She's a lecturer in public policy for over the last 20 years at the Harvard Kennedy School. Previously, she helped spearhead the New Democrat movement in the 1980s and worked in the Clinton White House and has been a member of the DNC and the DNC's Rules Committee for over 20 years. And she's also been a 5-time superdelegate, which kind of got a little more attention a couple of years ago than it had in the past. She makes regular appearances. Am I supposed to say that? I pulled it right off here. Right. She makes regular appearances in all the major media. David Barker is professor. David Barker is professor of government, and he's the director of the Center for Congressional and Presidential Studies at American University. He's the author of numerous articles and books. Please take special note of his upcoming Oxford University Press book, One Nation, Two Realities. I've already read most of it. Even though it's not out yet, Dueling Facts in American Democracy. And by the way, there'll be a book event here at the Kluge Center early next year. It really is fascinating. So we're going to jump right into starting to think about, in an analytical way, congressional elections in general, in particular midterm elections. So I want to hit some generic things first, and I'm going to start with David at that end. In beginning any analysis of midterm elections, forget about that we're in 2018, just anyone on a generic standpoint. What are the key factors that you take into consideration?
So you start with the president's approval rating. All midterm elections are referendums on the sitting president. And historically, any president with an approval rating under 50 traditionally loses a lot of seats. The average is in the 40s. And indeed, all presidents except 3 in the history of the United States have lost seats during midterms. So you start there. Another thing that you want to take a look at is the state of the economy. This is an unusual year because we have a very strong economy and a very unpopular president. So that statistic that I mentioned a second ago, where unpopular presidents tend to translate into big seat losses, typically those unpopular presidents are partially unpopular because of a downward trending economy. So this is a really unusual year, and it's going to be a test of these competing theories as to presidential approval and economic factors. Just a third thing that I'll mention that is important is the size of the victory by the president 2 years earlier. So typically, really big midterm losses correspond to big coattails 2 years earlier. So when there's a big victory like in 1964, 1972, to a lesser extent 1992 or 2008, then you tend to see the big loss 2 years later because a lot of people were swept in on the coattails. We obviously don't have that situation this time.
Elaine, what would you add to that? What do you look at irrespective of the particular year?
Well, I mean, let me dig deeper on one of the points you made. Midterm elections are not always about the presidential candidate or the president, rather. It varies. And we've had midterm elections that are really local. You know, it's just what the local issues are, who's running, et cetera. But increasingly, we seem to have what the political scientists call nationalized midterm elections. We've just in recent years, 2006 was nationalized. 2010 was nationalized. And this one looks to be a heavily nationalized election. Now, one of the reasons that this happens is you got to think about it this way. People who are in the business of politics they're planning their careers in a long-term fashion, the way you would in your business, right? And so if you're sitting around in 2017 and you're looking at this president kind of bumbling along and having a hard time getting his footing, et cetera, and you're a county commissioner someplace and you've always wanted to run for Congress, you say, this year I'm getting in, okay? Because this year might be a good year for my party. And if you were sitting around in Congress in 2009 as Barack Obama ran into problems getting out of the recession and his health care bill, et cetera, you might say, good year for me, a Republican to get in. So what intermediates this phenomenon is something we call quality candidates. So good candidates, people with a base in the district, know something about the business of running for office, can raise money, et cetera, they tend to get in years when it's looking good for their party. And we see some evidence of that this time around on the Democratic side. The converse of that is if you're a Republican and you're sitting around in 2017 or a Democrat sitting around in 2009, you say to yourself, maybe it's time I retired. Maybe it's time I went and became a lobbyist and made money or did something else. Spent more time with my children. That's a goodie.
Sarah, what would you add to that? And also, maybe you could speak to, neither of them said the magic word money or campaign finance, so maybe you could speak to that, but what else would you add?
Well, I think, adding to those points, I would add two things that I would look for. One is the enthusiasm gap, and that plays out in many forms in self-reported polls. We've seen in this election, Democrats for virtually the entire cycle have had a significantly higher enthusiasm gap. I should say level of enthusiasm over the Republicans. The enthusiasm gap has been higher for Democrats. In 2010 and 2014, Republicans had a significantly higher gap over their Democrats, and of course they did very well in those midterms. I always look at the generic ballot. I think it tends to be a little less effective than it was 15 years ago. There's so many other things to measure, but the generic ballot, which is a self-reported polling question where they say they're getting rid of the names of the irrespective candidates. Would you be more likely to vote for the Democrat or the Republican candidate? And Democrats have had, I would say roughly an 8 to 12 point lead in the generic ballot most of this cycle. even prior to, the recent Supreme Court front page news. So those are two other things I look at. And then, of course, money does matter, although money is increasingly less important, and it's much less important when the election is nationalized. And I agree a lot with ELAINE. We've had a series, 5 of the last 6 elections have been change elections. The last 3 midterms were change elections. This appears to be a change election. We're in a period of enormous political tumult in this country that has a lot more to do with, if you sort of think back about the rapid pace of change in society over the last 20 or 30 years, quickening pace of change, technology, finance, the way wars are fought in this country, significant demographic changes. There's a lot underlying our politics. Donald Trump is a symptom of the times, not the opposite way. And so I think all of those factors mean we're going to have a nationalized election. Money is going to be less important. There are going to be people who lose. Incumbents with more money are going to lose because of the nationalized nature of this election.
David, you wanted to add something?
I just want to add something on the campaign finance, which is that money is important, but it's really a threshold. There are diminishing returns to it. So you have to have a certain amount of money to be able to run an effective campaign and put ads out there and buy, have staff and all that kind of stuff that you need to do just to be competitive. But once you get above that threshold of competitiveness, then you can, raise $50 million more, and it's not really going to make that much of a difference. In fact, it's frequently the case that the candidate who raises and spends more money loses. And I mean, this is a panel about midterm elections, but if we want one example of that, we can look to 2016 when Clinton raised and outspent Trump by a very significant margin, and that didn't really matter too much.
I think money, one final point in that, the higher the office, the less impactful dollars are.
That's a good point.
And I agree with David, that oftentimes money isn't relevant, but in the Senate races, in a midterm that's not nationalized, money matters a lot more than it does, I think, in a year like this where, the whole country appears to be, paying attention to Donald Trump's Twitter feed.
So the ELAINE and Sarah in particular harped on the idea that the election is more nationalized, and it used to be you'd have a panel like this, and in the first 5 minutes somebody would say, well, all politics is local. They'd quote Tip O'Neill, and then they'd quit and go to questions in the reception. But it's different now, and I was looking up some statistics in preparing for this, and I noticed that in 1988, over 40% of the House seats in those districts, over 40% of them went for different parties for president and for the House. And that's Dukakis, for those of you who don't remember or weren't alive, Michael Dukakis lost pretty badly to President Bush, or then Vice President Bush. But the Democrats maintained the House quite easily, in fact, when you look at it in the sweep of history. And so and nowadays it's like there's a few seats that are like that regularly regularly split tickets, where a lot of people are splitting tickets, which yielded the kind of result I described in 1988. So let's just nail it down. What specific has changed, and how does that affect our analysis this time? You guys have sort of touched on it, but let's get specific. ELAINE, do you want to tackle that?
Yeah, well, first of all, first thing to say on that is there are 24 House seats that Hillary Clinton won the district and a Republican won. And if you look at those, most of them are, right in the bullseye, where the Democrats are concentrating their efforts to try to take back those seats.
That's as compared to 200 that were like that in 1988.
That's right.
Except
exactly.
They were,
Many, many fewer. I think that there's a couple of structural changes. I think one is, interestingly enough, the disappearance of local newspapers and the diminishment of local news. So you can't have a localized race if nobody's reporting on local issues, right? And we at Brookings have a big project called the Primaries Project. For those of you interested in it, we're publishing lots of papers, and we're about to publish 3 major reports. And what we do in that is we code people's websites, okay? And we don't even take a sample, we do the whole universe, all the Republicans, all the Democrats who run, and we look at their websites. And what's interesting is how little variation that there is, right? The Republicans talk about the same 5 or 6 things, the Democrats talk about the same 5 or 6 things. There's very rarely local issues on these websites. Now, I'm sure that if you, I mean, we couldn't have done the same research 20 years ago because nobody had websites, but I'm sure if you were able to somehow have a standard measure of candidate message 20, 30 years ago, we wouldn't have found that. I think we would have found a lot more local issues. So between the non-reporting of that has, and the absence of a local press has really helped, I think, to further nationalize these campaigns.
David.
So, a couple of things. First of all, to pick up on the media aspect, in addition to the decline of local reporting across the country, as everybody in this room knows, we've had an increase in terms of partisan news, right? And so starting in the 90s with talk radio, and then in cable with Fox and MSNBC, and then with websites, and then with social media, right? Increasingly, people get their news filtered through partisan sources, and that actually contributes to the nationalization of politics because, Rush Limbaugh or Sean Hannity or Rachel Maddow don't talk about local issues, and that's where people get their news, not from local. The other couple of things that I'll mention is that over the course of the past, 10 years or so, there have been 2 books called The Big Sort, and they were talking about different things, but both of those sorts are relevant here. The first, quote-unquote, big sort has to do with the fact that it's mostly in the South, right? The formerly solid Democratic South, where you had really, really conservative Democrats, right? There used to be basically 3 parties in this country: a National Republican Party, a Northern Democratic Party, and a Southern Democratic Party. And the Southern Democratic Party were the most conservative. Still, as of 1988, there were lots of conservative Democrats in the South. That has changed. People have sorted themselves ideologically, right? And so now there are very few conservative Democrats. There are very few liberal Republicans. And that means you're going to have fewer people, balancing their ticket or switching votes. The other thing is the big sort in terms of neighborhood sorting or clustering or where people live, right? And so increasingly, Republicans and Democrats don't live in the same cities or towns or neighborhoods or blocks like they used to. I mean, Democrats increasingly live and are clustered, really, in a few heavily concentrated metropolitan areas on the coasts and a few other places around, college towns and et cetera, whereas Republicans live everywhere else. And so that along with gerrymandering has created these districts that are overwhelmingly Democratic or overwhelmingly Republican, and in those sorts of districts, people are going to vote the party line.
So where do Republicans live in the Washington area, Sarah? I'm just teasing.
They hide.
They don't go to dinner, what I
On
understand.
Edgewood Street in Arlington.
One example that sort of illustrates some of the things these folks have said, Sarah's originally from Iowa, and in 1994, which we didn't know at the time this was a trend, but there was a congressman who never was challenged going all the way back 36 years named Neil Smith, and all he did every time was explain, hey, I'm on appropriations, and every building in Ames, Iowa, and every hospital in this entire district has my name on it, remember? And then suddenly, based on a national wave, a plastic surgeon who's never done any politics at all and didn't particularly have a tremendous amount of political ability, beat him easily. And that was, looking back on it, you're like, oh yeah, that's the beginning of everything. But that happened a lot in 1994. Yeah. But so one thing I wanted to bring up with respect to the generic ballot that Sarah brought up is like, well, how useful is it? You go on 538 and you see Democrats are ahead by this much. I did a little research on that, and I looked back. If you go to other decades, even the first decade of this century or further back, you see that the overall vote total in the House more or less reflected what would happen in the distribution of House seats in the general election. So if Democrats got 55% of the two-party vote, they'd get more or less 55% of the seats. What you see since 2010 is a very different thing, where now the commentariat says, hey, Democrats have to win in the generic ballot or the overall vote by at least 7 in order to be assured of winning. What has happened? What's the difference here?
Well, I think some of it is the way redistricting has happened, and we've talked about the self-sorting and so forth, but if you sort of think through, partisan redistricting has gotten more partisan, and Republicans have had an important sort of thumb on the scale, particularly the last 10 years, just given their dominance. Ironically, for as weak as Republicans may be on the enthusiasm gap or the generic ballot today, in many respects, the party's at a high watermark in terms of the number of seats it holds, governor's seats, state legislative chambers that they have control of course, control both chambers of Congress across the street. So partisan redistricting, has helped a lot with that. I think, Democrats, in fact, have a good year this year. They'll be pretty well set up heading into the next decade for redistricting, and you'll see some of that counterbalance. And then also a lot of it is turnout. At a presidential year, you'll get significantly higher turnout, of course, and much of the Democratic base are the folks that don't show up in in midterm elections. They show up in presidential elections, but when you think of, where are the biggest gaps, it tends to be single women, minority voters, younger voters. They tend to vote only in presidential elections. And so as a result, Republicans have outperformed in midterms because their older, whiter voters tend to show up, and they show up consistently. So we'll see what happens this year. There's a lot of discussion about the energized Democratic base. It's been like that most of the year. But historically speaking, some of those groups of voters have underperformed midterms.
David, you were going to piggyback on that.
Yeah, so I just want to mention two things with respect to that. The first is that the group that I think for whom that is the most true, or the gap that is most important there, is the age gap. There have been an awful lot of progressive Democratic candidates over the years that have, dreamed of winning big because they were going to turn out the youth, and it just doesn't really ever happen, right? Some of you may remember Howard Dean is one name that comes to mind, and even when they do, right? Young people turned out in higher numbers for Obama both times, but the gap still between people in their 20s or 30s and people in their 50s, 60s, and older is enormous. Now, the other thing that I'll say, though, is there is one countervailing trend to this general truism that Republicans tend to have a turnout advantage, and that has been another realignment, if you want to say, with respect to education. So one of the factors that's most predictive of turnout is education, right? People with college degrees and higher tend to turn out at higher levels than people who don't. And, 40 years ago, Republicans had a big advantage with college-educated voters. 20 years ago, it was about even, or Republicans still might have had a slight advantage. But now, Democrats have a 22 or 23 percentage point advantage with college-educated voters. They have a 33 or 35 percentage point advantage with voters with advanced degrees. And so that may counter the age gap and some of the other gaps that we talked about.
ELAINE,
Yeah, and let me just do one other thing on age, because Sarah's absolutely right on that. The thing that keeps giving Democrats hope is not just the turnout, hoping for bigger turnout, but the different generations are either bigger or smaller. Mm-hmm. So us baby boomers, there were a heck of a lot of us. And to everybody's surprise, we had a heck of a lot of children called millennials. The millennial generation is the biggest generation in American history. So generations are important when they're big.
Yeah.
See, nobody talks about the voting behavior of Gen Xers, unfortunately, for those of you who might be Gen Xers, right? Because there just weren't very many Gen Xers.
And we're tired and bored.
And you're tired and boring. But when you have a big generation, when you have what we call a pig in the python, right? As that generation moves through, you got to imagine
and eventually
that, right?
comes out. Yeah.
As that generation moves through the electorate, their voting behavior becomes quite significant simply because there's so many of them.
yeah. Less creative people used to say lumping a snake, so I'll give you that. Sorry, ELAINE.
That's okay. And so what we know so far about the millennial generation is they have tended to vote Democratic.
Yeah.
Okay, they don't like to call themselves Democrats, right? But it doesn't matter. When push comes to shove, they vote Democratic. Barack Obama's entire margin of victory in 2008 came from people under 30.
Yeah.
Okay, if you'd taken them out of the equation, he was neck and neck in all the other age cohorts. So it's not just old versus young, it's the size of generations and whether or not they express a partisan preference and then stick with it.
You know, one thing I wanted to ask Sara about, because Sara is one of the people, you know, who's prominent, and I mean, she's done the nitty-gritty on the ground electioneering, both literally the ground game, as well as other forms of campaigning. I mean, she orchestrated that as a career and is still doing some of that. What's changed in terms of campaigning and electioneering over the last, 2.5 decades or so since you've been involved? And also, does the campaign matter very much? You know, how does campaigning matter?
So I think the campaign does still matter a lot. It's much harder to have control over your campaign as a candidate, particularly a candidate for Senate and governor, because of the way campaign finance laws have changed and the outsized influence now of third-party groups. So, you can very easily lose control of your message if another entity comes in and spends significantly more than you and changes the narrative of what you want to talk about. And that happens, and people oftentimes get very frustrated with the outside groups in their own parties because of that. What's changed overall, though, I would say, is, I started working in, my first campaigns were, as a kid, but my first paid jobs were in college, Branstad for governor, and Gansky, who you mentioned earlier, for Congress. We did some work on those. It was a small business back then, like, little b business. You had grassroots activists, you did some mail, you'd organize phone banks, and those activities still exist as the lifeblood of the campaign, but it's a really big business now. It's the amount of money has grown exponentially, the amount of sophistication of communication and targeting. It takes data scientists to run a campaign, even particularly at a statewide level, but even in most congressional campaigns, they're now, working with, advanced voter files and analytics. And like I said, there's teams of data people involved in them and digital targeting. And, it used to be way more shoe leather. And, there's real benefits to some of that. And of course, there's, some downsides to it as well.
What are your all's answer to the question of, do campaigns matter?
I think they do. Sarah's right in the way that they've changed. But I do think campaigns matter, and it's interesting, a lot of times they matter when somebody screws up.
Yeah.
Okay, so all you have to do is think back to Todd Aiken, the Republican candidate for Senate in Missouri, saying that, women who were raped couldn't get pregnant because their body went into some kind of, altered state, and they couldn't get pregnant if they were raped. It's like, what? And, that did it for him. So, the campaign does matter, particularly when somebody just makes a big mistake, or when you find out something about someone that was hidden. They have a drunk driving record. They have something else that they've done in their past that gets unearthed in the course of the campaign. But in terms of, arguing over your Social Security plan, I just don't see the campaign really mattering all that much.
Yeah, I would say that campaigns frequently matter in sort of an indirect way, in that they make what we refer to as the fundamentals matter more, right? Because it's through campaigning that people get reminded of partisanship, right? So campaigning can activate partisanship just by simply reminding, the important targeted voters, hey, like, this is the Democratic or Republican candidate, this is the person that you're supposed to be voting for, through ads, or especially through micro-targeting, social media, et cetera. And the second thing that I'll say, and this piggybacks on Sara as well, is that they matter in that, getting people to the polls aspect, right? And again, that's done in a much more sophisticated way than it used to be through the micro-targeting and whatnot. But it's not like you're going to persuade that many voters through campaigning, but you are going to try to make sure that your people get to the polls, and campaigns are a lot better at that than they used to be.
So how many seats are in play in the House, David, this year? Let's going to get to the fun part. We're going to talk about 2018, what's going to happen. I might even force them into a prediction, but maybe not. We'll see. We'll see how they do.
Let's do that. I'm ready for that.
Then we're not going there
I've
yet.
been
But just straight out, how many, all of you, we'll start with David.
Yeah,
How many House seats are in play?
Roughly 60.
Okay.
I'd say about 70.
What do you think?
I'd say 55.
55. So we're sort of in range here. And in the Senate, how many? We'll start with you.
6 or 7.
Yeah.
I'd say about 5.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, if you really want to be generous, right, you could imagine up to 10, but in reality, I'd say more like 6.
Okay, so we'll get back to specific things to look at, but here's a question that kind of, I think this is a hard one, so I'm just going to let anybody who wants to talk to it, but, and it's been anticipated by some of what you've said, particularly I think something David said earlier. The economy's going great guns right now. Although, don't look at your stocks today. Or,
Yeah, right.
right.
Don't look at the stock market today.
Just have a look at the Wall Street Journal today. And so there's two things. They're different, but they're going to play in. The economy's going great. Unemployment's like -3 or whatever. The Republicans didn't pick up any seats in the House in 2016 because in part because their candidate didn't win a plurality of the vote. And they have thus relatively few vulnerable seats. I think you got into that, David. As compared to, say, Democrats had in 2010 after they've gone through 2 cycles of winning lots of seats. And they had a lot of people who should never have been elected. You get into that situation, who are going to be more vulnerable. Yet, analysts are saying this year that Republicans are in deep trouble in the House and maybe even have a small chance of losing the Senate. What is going on here?
It's a really interesting phenomenon. And, I think there's sort of some environmental factors that certainly caused the House to be in play, which we mentioned earlier. The president's a low approval rating. But, what is highly unusual is that you have a president with a low job approval rating and a really strong economy.
Yeah.
And just to put in context how strong the economy is, it's the single, I've always looked at, and I sort of learned this working on the Bush reelect from another strategist on the team, studying the Conference Board President Situation Index. You study it, you look at the trend line, and over time, since the thing has been measured, if an incumbent president running for re-election has a trend line going up, he has been re-elected, and if he has a trend line going down, he has lost. And you can look at every president, and the Reagan and Clinton economies, and the consumer confidence is high and trending up. So you'd look at all the clusters, and you did it in a period of time before their election, their reelect. And you, of course, would see Clinton and the Reagan economies up here, the Bush 41 and Carter economies down here. Well, Trump is over here. Like, it's off. It's really strong right now. And so I do wonder if that's going to blunt some of this. And that he's personally unpopular, but his job approval in terms of his actions in office are higher. And this was something people measured in the Clinton years. People didn't personally like Bill Clinton because of some of the antics and the Me Too stuff before Me Too was a movement. But they thought he did a really good job in office, and they rewarded him for it and rewarded Democrats for it. And I think we're going to see some of that blunt some Democrat wins. We also have had a significant number of retirements as a party. More retirements out of this Congress, I think, than at any point since the 30s. And that's going to...
Mostly Republicans.
Mostly Republicans. So it's going to cause Republicans to lose seats that had the party been more organized and kept people in office, they'd probably be in a better position to retain the House today.
How do you guys, ELAINE, how do you look at that question, or either one of you?
You're absolutely right. It's really is a conundrum here, this president. But what you see in a lot of the public opinion polls are people saying, we need a Democratic Congress to check this president. And their concerns about this president are not the classic ones. Is he handling the economy right? Is he, it's not a policy concern. It's a concern about, frankly, his authoritarian tendencies. And so people are worried about democracy. They're worried about the norms of the country because he's been a norm breaker ever since he got into office. And he doesn't seek to unite the country like most presidents have done. He's very divisive. And so I think you have another issue out there, which is his behavior vis-a-vis the democratic process. And that's in competition with the more classic behaviors that we've studied, like how good the economy is. Do you approve of, the way he's conducting his policies in office? The way to look at this, and Sarah mentioned this, was in 1998. That's one of the few years where the incumbent president actually didn't lose seats, but actually gained seats in a midterm. And Clinton had been impeached that year. He'd been impeached.
Which is something for the Democrats to remember in about a year.
Something for the Democrats to remember. He'd been impeached. He was not convicted in the Senate. And what happened was people made a decision that they liked what he was doing as president, even though the ratings of him personally were very low because of his dalliances with a White House intern. So that's something to bear in mind as we look at what's coming up.
So a couple of things that are different, I think, that help to explain why we've got this conundrum of a really strong economy and a really unpopular president is that unlike Clinton, where, as Sarah said, people didn't necessarily like him personally, but they thought that he was doing well in office. The median voter believed that, right? The independents, right? And even some Republicans sort of believed that Clinton was doing well policy-wise in office, and why wouldn't they, right? I mean, he was a right-of-center president in a lot of ways. But people who opposed Trump, right, basically, all Democrats and a plurality of independents, right, don't just dislike him personally, although it's impossible to overstate how much they dislike him personally, right? They also think that he is bad at his job, right? And so in that way, it's different than Trump, right? They oppose his policies. They oppose the tax cut. They oppose the immigration plan. They oppose pulling out of the climate accord. They oppose pulling out of Iran. They oppose sort of like offending everybody in Europe, right? They oppose the shift on trade, and they oppose basically everything. They oppose all the deregulation and everything, right? We can go on and on and on and on and on and on, right? And so that's different. The other thing that is different is that if you think about those presidents who were reelected with strong economies and the trajectory, in every one of those cases, the economy had been going poorly, right? And then that new president came in and things got better, right? So Reagan came in, it took a couple of years, right? But the economy had been struggling throughout most of the 70s and definitely at the end of the Carter administration. It continued to for a couple of years, but then it took off, right? And that fueled Reagan's popularity. The same was true, right, with Clinton, right, where, again, the economy had been strong in the 80s, but we'd had a recession in the 90s right before Clinton took office. Same was true with Obama, right? We had the Great Recession, and then Obama comes in, and things slowly tick up, not fast enough to anybody's satisfaction, but things slowly got better over the course of his administration. The difference this time, right, is that the Trump economy that trend line is just a continuation. Instead of going like this and then like this, the economy has been going like this for 10 years, right, or was going like this for 8 years prior to Trump coming in, and it has continued to go like this, right? And so that might explain that conundrum to some degree.
So we're going to do one sort of fun question, and then we'll get to one more substantive question, and then go to your questions. Yeah. The fun one is, in the next few weeks, what are the bellwethers? What are you watching, either House or Senate? What would you tell the audience to say, hey, watch this, this will give you a sense, anything will give you a sense of where things are headed. And then also maybe you could throw in your prediction. Who wants to start? ELAINE, why don't you start?
Okay. Well, all right, I'm going to watch 2 Senate races. I'm going to watch the Heitkamp race in North Dakota to see if she bounces back from her opposition to Kavanaugh and begins to close that gap. She has come from behind before. There's a lot of money pouring into that state, so that's possible. I will also watch the Texas Senate race with Beto O'Rourke and Ted Cruz. Because if Beto O'Rourke comes within a point or two, that's a pretty significant shift. And it's a pretty, even if he loses. If he wins, then they're going to call this not the blue wave, but they're going to call it the blue tsunami. Okay? And that's what it's going to be. I'm going to also watch those California races. 7 out of the 24 districts that the Democrats need to flip the House are in California. And California has been going increasingly blue. So if those races all look solid, then it means Democrats don't have to pick up that many seats in other parts of the country. So watch those California races. Many of them are in Southern California, Orange County, which has gone through a demographic change, as well as, you know, the opposition to Trump. So that's what I'm watching.
And your prediction?
I think the Senate will stay close and stay in Republican hands. I think the Democrats will pick up 30 to 40 seats in the House.
David, you going to go next?
Sure. So let me pick up on Texas. So I grew up in Texas, and people, and it's easy for me, right, when I think about the state that I grew up in, to imagine Texas turning blue as being some sort of, you know, crazy, wild-eyed liberal pipe dream. But it's important to think about something in 2016, which is that Hillary Clinton lost Texas by a smaller margin than she lost Ohio. And Sherrod Brown is going to win by double digits in Ohio, and Sherrod Brown is a very liberal
Senate race.
Yeah, he's you know, competing, defending his seat in the Senate. Very progressive Democrat. Some would call him shrill, and he's going to win easily in a place that really should be worse for Democrats now than Texas. If you take 2016 as the marker on that. And so what that means, and I'll say Sherrod Brown is more progressive than Beto O'Rourke. And so I don't actually think that it will be as much of a shocker if O'Rourke is able to win in Texas. It's not, to me, it would be a bigger shock if Bredesen were to win in Tennessee, right? And so in terms of other things to pay attention to, in addition to Texas and in addition to North Dakota, although I've kind of already written Heitkamp off there, I would also pay attention to Missouri, where Claire McCaskill is in deep trouble and probably outside of Heitkamp, the Democrat who's in the biggest trouble. I would say, well, I'll leave that alone. Yeah, and I guess Tennessee. We'll see if the Taylor Swift effect makes any difference. Yeah.
And what are you doing for your predictions?
In the House, we're going to call it a blue tide, not a blue wave, for a whole host of reasons, some of which we touched on here and Sarah alluded to. It's harder for blue waves to happen than red waves, and so I'm going to say 30 seats in the House. And I'm going to say that Democrats lose a couple in the Senate and they win a couple in the Senate, and it evens right back out. So we stay right where we are.
Sarah, what are you looking at?
Well, I'll just continue on the Texas theme. I think, 4 weeks ago, Ted Cruz would have won by 3 or 4 points, and I think today he'll win by 6 or 7 points because I think it's still a Republican state, although it has gotten increasingly blue. But it's still a Republican state, and I think the hyper-partisan nature of the Supreme Court fight, really manifests itself in places like Missouri, North Dakota, but also Texas. I also think Beto O'Rourke while he may be less progressive than Sherrod Brown, he's quite progressive for Texans, and I think Ted Cruz has got a real campaign apparatus now in motion on this. Maybe they weren't taking him as seriously as they should have been earlier. I'm also watching these House districts. My view, and this could change because passions were inflamed. The whole nation was, focused on the Supreme Court, and 4 weeks is an eternity in an election cycle. But assuming Republicans are now more enthusiastic, and Democrats were basically already at 11 before the Supreme Court hearing, they don't have much room to grow. Republicans had a lot of room to grow, and they've grown. And so I look at all these House seats that are plus 7% Republican advantage in the partisan registration or the partisan identification in the district that were lean Republican seats, or in some cases even swing seats, like a seat like Andy Barr seat in Kentucky, where that's maybe not the best example because there's a lot of colleges there, but there were a number of really what should be Republican districts that were, quote, in play. I don't think those are in play anymore. So I still think from a prediction perspective, just based on the math, there's so many swing seats that are Republicans, and there's so many Republican retirements, and you have a president under 40, it's probably very difficult for Republicans to retain control. But I would have said 3 or 4 weeks ago, Democrats probably pick up 40 seats, and I think they probably pick up just enough to get them over the hump.
Sort of 25 to 30 in that range.
Yeah, something like that. And then the Senate, I think Republicans, probably, maybe net lose one only. And maybe not, maybe lose none. Yeah.
And so the last thing I want to ask about is there's been a lot of talk, and we'll start with you, Sara, that this is potentially the year of the woman. What does that actually mean in tangible terms? I mean, to the extent that might be true, what does that mean in tangible terms?
Well, first of all, it was the year of the woman long before there was a Supreme Court opening. And the reason it was the year of the opening, in part, is because certainly in the aftermath of the 2016 election, some women in this country felt like Donald Trump's behavior toward women was not properly addressing the election, and they felt very emboldened to get involved. There's also a cultural movement that spans sports and entertainment and the news industry and across the board where, appropriate workplace conduct had a big light shone on it, and it needed to, and it was a good thing. Just to put some practical numbers around it, though, if you look at the number of women who are running for office in the House, I think 50% of the nominees are Democrats in the House. 50% of the Democrat nominations are women. You've had significantly, I have actually this chart, it's going to be really hard to see it, but you've had basically 450 women run for the House. And while many of them are Democrats, you've also had over 100 Republican women run, which is significantly more than any year in history. It's true in the Senate as well. You've had almost 50 women run for the Senate. Most of them are Democrats, but you've had almost 20 Republican women run as well. So it's across the board, and it scales in proportion to the percentage of people previously involved, and it's a good thing. And I think women getting involved more actively in the political process will help dramatically actually move back to a place where we have conversation and bipartisanship.
I mean, both of you have been involved in politics. ELAINE, even longer than Sara. What's your perspective on it?
Thanks. That really
by a month or two.
Makes me feel
by
great.
A month or two,
yeah, by a month.
But what's your perspective on that?
There's going to be more women in the Congress, no doubt about it. And the number of women who are activated this time is truly amazing. So there's been a generational shift here. The scholarship on women in politics is that one of the big differences is that women always waited to be asked. Okay, well, guess what? This new generation is not waiting to be asked. They're acting like men. They're just looking in the mirror and saying, "Hello, Madam Senator." Okay, the joke used to always be that any 28-year-old man in the country would look at himself and say, "Hello, Mr. President," and a 28-year-old woman would say, "Oh dear, I could never do that." So this seems to be going away with the new generation, thank God. And I also think, and we see this in all the races we've seen in the special elections. There is an enormous gender gap between the parties. I mean, the Republican Party is the man's party, the Democratic Party is the woman's party, just to be simple about it. And there's just lots more women voting for Democrats. The hope for the Democrats is suburban Republican women crossing over because they don't like Trump. Remember, the day after a president was inaugurated, you had a women's march on Washington that was all about opposing that new president. So something's happened here. I don't know how long this will exist, you know what I mean? I don't know how permanent it is, but there's definitely a big gender split in our politics these days, and I've never seen anything like it.
And so roughly, what is that split? What is that gap? Do you know the numbers, David?
It's like 20 points.
Yeah, it's about 20 points. It's huge. And now, if it's 20 points evenly, right, it sort of doesn't make any difference, except there are slightly more women than men in the world, okay? And women have higher turnout rates than men do. That's began to happen in the 80s. Now, I'm showing my age now in spite of what I said. So when I was a baby political scientist, women did not turn out as much as men did. And the reason was that you still had in the electorate women who were socialized in an era when they didn't have the vote, okay? And even when they got the vote, it wasn't sort of something women were supposed to do. Well, you know, fast forward 30 years, and they're all dead, okay? And they're not in the electorate anymore. So you don't have any generations of women who think it's weird that women should vote, okay? So this has been, so now you have slightly more women, and you have much higher turnout of women. And this makes a big, big difference. You know, the big problem journalists have in election analysis is they always look at percentages and they forget about the arithmetic, okay? So guess what? Having a 1-point advantage amongst 51% of the electorate, that's big numbers, right? Whereas having a 1-point advantage among 8% of the electorate is not.
Yeah.
And so, you know, there's just a lot of women around to
And
win.
so you're going to have the last word before we get to a few questions.
Two final things to say on that. First of all, with the turnout differential between men and women, ELAINE is completely right on that. However, until this year, it appears, right, the gap in terms of turnout of women turning out more was much more true in presidential years than in midterms, right? And so women tended to turn out much higher rates than men in presidential years, and then maybe like slightly higher than men in midterm years, or even to men in midterm years. Whereas this year, right, all the indicators are that women will turn out at higher rates than men, in similar rates that they do in presidential elections. And so that's really significant. The other thing I'll say, just with respect to the year of the woman, is that anybody who thinks that Nancy Pelosi is in trouble is probably wrong, right? I mean, I think this is going to be the wrong year, right, to oust Nancy Pelosi as Speaker.
Yeah,
All right.
but can I just say, if Pelosi, Hoyer, and Clyburn deliver a Democratic House with a significant margin, none of them are going anyplace. Okay, this is all nonsense.
Okay, so indicate to me if you're interested in asking a question. We have the lady right there, Linda. You want to give Linda?
Thank you. Mention was made of the essential role that data scientists play in election campaigns today. I've always been curious, though, what happened with the data science when they predicted Clinton's win for the presidential campaign? Can you explain that?
Yeah, so it's a good question, and I think you're really asking a question about the polling, and a couple thoughts. One, the polling actually wasn't wrong on the national election. It showed Hillary Clinton winning, by a few points, and she did win the popular vote by almost 2 points. She did not, of course, win key electoral states like Michigan and Wisconsin, and I think, at least in one of those states, I think it was Wisconsin, she didn't even step foot in the entire time. Now, the polling on some of those states was off, but it was also because there wasn't very much of it.
Right.
And so there was nothing recent, and the Trump campaign was just very, sophisticated and playing in those states and playing quite quietly until the very end when they played quite publicly and won them, and they played the Electoral College very well. There is a problem with polling. It tends to be more accurate nationally and harder to predict in states because of the sample size. It's increasingly difficult to get people on a landline. And fundamentally, polling still works if it's done properly, and if it's a mix of sort of internet, landline, and increasingly cell phone technology. And what happens, and why a lot of news polls are off, is because, not all of them, some of them are still quite good, some of them are really off, particularly the auto dials, but is they don't do cell phones, or they don't do a big enough percentage of people with cell phones because it's really expensive to call cell phones, because the laws prevent research companies, if you're calling someone on a cell phone, you have to manually dial it. You can't use an auto dialer for cell phones. So it dramatically raises the costs, and as a result of it, they skimp on the cell phones, and they get too high of proportion of whatever, population, whether it's poor or older or some combination, that only has a landline telephone.
Yeah, not only is of course, Sarah's right that the polls reflected Hillary winning the popular vote, but the better data scientists did say Trump could win.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
It was, it depends whom, it's like with anything on the internet, you're bombarded with information. Are you getting the better information? Can you separate wheat from chaff? And,
Haskell, you're the
less.
moderator.
Yeah.
I want to remind you, you're the moderator.
Were you about to say that, David? All right, next question over here.
No, I didn't want to quickly just say that not only were the data scientists, as opposed to the pollsters or the pundits, the real data scientists did give Trump about a 1 in 3 chance of winning, which, if you flip a bunch of coins, right, 1 in 3 happens quite a bit, right? And so that was the deal there. And also I will say that part of the reason why he was able to win unexpectedly in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan was because of the micro-targeting done as a result of some of the data science that was done by that campaign in those states. The final thing I'll say about the polling, though, is that part of the reason why it's hard to get good polls in states is that when you do, in addition to it being really expensive to call cell phones, hardly anybody has an area code that is associated with where they actually live, right? And so that's like fine for a national poll, right? But you think you're calling somebody in Wisconsin, in reality you're calling somebody in California, and all of that. So anyway.
So that gentleman right there, I think, Gage, he's why don't you get the microphone for a second?
I was interested in some of your thoughts about these new approaches to elections. I had read about this approach called ranked choice voting, and I was interested in what you all think about that.
Elaine, do you know anything about that?
I think ranked choice voting is very interesting. I think, when I first heard about it back in the dark ages, it was before computers, so, that it was kind of mind-boggling how you would get an accurate count. These days, you could use ranked choice voting. I think it's very interesting as a possibility in primaries.
Yeah.
Where you tend not to have a binary, and the differences between the candidates are not all that great. But other than the state of Maine, which just tried it, nobody else seems very interested in it. And when I talk to members of Congress or I talk to elected officials about it, they sort of stare at you blankly, like, huh? So I think the uncertainty about, it's like anything, when you change an electoral system, it's the incumbents who have to change it, and the incumbents who are most fearful of it, because after all, they won in the old system. So it's a good idea. It's not at all a bad idea. It's just one that I don't see happening very quickly.
So we're going to go one more question over here, and then we'll have an opportunity for people to meet the panel during the reception. But Kathy has a question.
Thank you very much for a very interesting panel. I have one question that goes back to the pig and the python. The millennial group, I didn't realize it was so big, as you just said it is. How likely is that group, based on your knowledge and experience, to shift its political affiliations as they move through the the age cycle? Are they going to go
Yeah.
from left to right to left, or just stay wherever they are? Just wondering what you think about that.
Sarah's eager to address that. It's a great question.
It is a great question. It's actually, I considered jumping in and saying, historically, as young people get older and buy homes and pay taxes and have, other more complex responsibilities in life, that they have tended to become conservative. Now, I think society is changing quite dramatically and quite rapidly, so I don't think that's guaranteed. And certainly some members of young generations would always stay, in either, more liberal or more conservative based on how they were raised. But, that's just a generation that's not particularly interested in owning things. They're very comfortable in a sharing economy. They're very, as ELAINE mentioned, I agree, they don't like Republicans or Democrats. They don't particularly assign themselves to any label. I think what's probably more likely than them becoming, some of them will move around over time and based on issues. But I think what's more likely politically is that we're going to see more parties in this country. And we're certainly going to see independent candidates and more meaningful independent candidates. It's very difficult to get on the ballot in a presidential race, for example. But social media, to a degree, makes that easier and makes it easier for people to organize. And I just think over time, you're likely to see a more diverse political system than necessarily a younger voter bloc sort of saying, okay, well, I was a liberal in my 20s and 30s, and now I'm a conservative in my 40s and 50s. And, I don't think in 20 years when those folks are older, we'll be in the same paradigm.
I think we have a topic for a whole other panel.
Yeah, right, a topic for a whole other
A whole
panel.
other panel.
Exactly right.
David has a word to say on that.
Yeah, so one thing that I think, aside from party identification and whether or not people switch, I think that one thing that is unlikely is that these millennials will become more culturally conservative over time. I think it may be the case that as they get older and own things and whatever, that they may become more economically conservative. I think that it's unlikely that they are going to become, well, some of them may become more religious, but the general trend towards secularization in society is not likely to reverse itself. The trend toward more tolerance toward sexual minorities is not likely to reverse itself. The trend toward greater tolerance toward racial and ethnic diversity is not likely to reverse itself. And so what I expect to see is that the culture war that we've been living in for the past 40 or 50 years, in another 20 years, may actually finally culminate, and the big things that we fight about politically may go back to what they were in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, which was about the free market versus the welfare state. If I would anticipate in 2050, if we have a panel like this, those will be the things that people are fighting about, and not race, not gender, and not religion, like we have been for the past 40.
Let me give a contrary view, okay? People who cast their first vote in 1932 for Franklin Roosevelt, that generation, by and large, stayed Democratic until they died, okay? There is an imprinting question that goes on. Your first political, and we know this from there's this whole study of this called political sociology, okay? We know that one of the things about the maligned Gen Xers is their political experience was Ronald Reagan. They tend to be Republicans. So there is something about whether or not you come into politics with some sort of dramatic election. Certainly 32 was a big dramatic election. 2008, because of the first African-American president, was a dramatic election. So there is some evidence that generations actually take their partisanship with them, even though they change and they get more conservative on economic questions or cultural questions, that there's an imprinting. And I would send you to a big literature on political sociology and cohort analysis, which shows this for American history.
Well, I can't help but point out the irony that Reagan himself voted for FDR.
Yes, Reagan himself voted for FDR.
Four times, actually. Thank you all very much, and American University for co-hosting.